Good day, and how are you doing today? It's April 24th, 2020. Just wanted to show you guys some of the VS Bypass tubes, show you how they work, show you how the shim stack works, and then compare it with our new super mid-valve, self-adjusting mid-valve, the do-everything mid-valve. So, some of you are familiar with the bypass tube. This is a pretty heavy tube that goes inside of the shock body, so it's a tube within a tube. And as this piston goes inside and pushes volume, you have the frontal energy, which we told you about in the previous videos, that pushes the energy up into the adjuster. Not every shock has an adjuster, but in this case what happens is when it's down, the shock is extended and the piston's closer to the bottom. Every bump that you hit and the shaft moves, it lets oil come out of these little flapper shims, which open up for compression. So under compression, it's like having an adjuster here, an adjuster there, an adjuster here and there. When you hit something, it reverts the oil back down around to the bottom of the bypass tube, virtually meaning it doesn't have that much of an adjuster to control or force fluid through the mid-valve piston. Once it gets higher up into the stroke, it goes past these and no longer do those affect, and then you have the last little bit of stroke is controlled by the shim stacks behind the piston, therefore increasing the frontal pressure, therefore increasing your bottoming resistancy. So the issue is low speed G outs, you're going to have a lot of blow off in your adjuster. The little tiny bumps, you have to make these shim stacks stiffer, of course, to control the little bumps. Some people drill bleed holes and make the suspension work radically inconsistent, or should I say super plush for slow speeds, but kind of lose control and you'll blow through the stroke the faster you go. They try to compensate by putting super stiff springs on there, try to compensate for the extra rebound by putting straps on there. You end up with a whole bunch of inconsistencies. So the problem is, like I told you before in the previous videos, this fluid is trying to go through this piston and it's going to come in at an angle. It's going to hit that shim stack and it's going to have to flow around that shim stack. And this is a meaty shim stack. It's not like it's a super light flexible shim stack. So if I get my little tool in there, I mean, that thing is super meaty to compress, which is good for your bottoming part of the stroke when you're at the end of the travel. This makes the mid-valve appear or seem softer on your top part of the stroke. It just adds a little bit of harshness because you can only get so much fluid out through there, and it's a give and take world. So if you take out the bypass and you just have your normal shock body without any of this, then your shim stack would have to be drastically softer because your initial part of the stroke would be really stiff when you're trying to hit bumps, little chops and bumps. And seen people, I think the Bilstein has a secondary piston behind, and then they use a high flow piston to kind of control that initial phase, and they use a little bit of a cavitation design to allow it to be plusher. So what we're going to do now is we're going to show you the Nost method. Now the Nost method eliminates, for the most part, the shim stack dilemma and the deflection dilemma. So let me get that out. I just wanted to show you how these bypass tubes work. You're kind of set with whatever Fox sends you for the tubes. as the locations and the shim stacks, which you can change the shim stacks on the side and you can change the shim stacks on the piston. The overall effects are obviously different no matter what you do. You can create lots of different variations, but you're not always going to get the best low speed character. You're not going to get the best bottoming character. You're not going to get the best traction character. You're not going to get the best rebound character. You're not going to get the there's a whole lot of features that limit you with a normal shim stack. And obviously trying to make a bypass tube, I mean, bypass tubes can be made to work. There's no doubt about that. That's not what we're saying. You can make suspension work and be better than a solid shaft, or be better than a cheap shock shaft with a spring on it. I mean, you can obviously create multiple different levels of enhanced suspension and valving and damping. But with a shim stack, the one thing that you're never going to get past is having super bottoming control and super plushness and a self-adjusting system. It's never going to self-adjust itself. It's literally set, and whatever you get, you get. And if you want to go back inside and tune it around, try to make it so you can go faster, versus I had it set up for trails, now I want to go out and race it, or now I want to go to the desert and hit big whoops and big G-outs, and then next weekend I want to go out to the trees, I want to hit rocks and logs and little choppy sections, and I don't want to feel it. So you're limited to what you can do. And then, for example, short course, stiffness is a huge factor for having your car roll factor, and being able to handle the big tabletops and the jumps they put in the track, as well as coming into the corner super hard and out of the corner super hard, getting good traction. You want the best of both worlds. There are companies like Gary at G-Force that can do amazing jobs at getting your shim stacks to work the best that they can work. And we like the shim stacks. They're usable, they're manageable, but my job here at Nost is to create new technology and to surpass what all of this stuff can do. And I don't like having this extra weight in there, and I like having something that self-adjusts itself. So let's set this off to the side and bring out the Nost Mid-valve. Now, I don't have a rebound stack on this. I'm not trying to show you the rebound. But we have a system, and it obviously takes up a little bit more space. It does have some pretty trick machine parts. A lot of this stuff can be changed, you know, for high production. We could easily do a cast piston. Could easily do metal stamping and forming and all. But I wanted to show you our piston design is cone valve design. It's got an inner and an outer cone. Now our inner cone, when it opens, it uses the splines for a guide so that it keeps centered, but it has a little tiny inverted cone on the inside, which in the case of flowing straight through volume, this inner cone section, when the oil comes straight through, it's able to go straight through the valve. It can open the inner cone up. The oil passes by on the inner part of the spline, I call it, and it comes through in a straighter control. And then when we take our outer cone seats into the piston, and we have what we call our auxiliary chamber. It's a chamber that goes all the way around the piston, and in doing that, it allows the oil to center up. We have holes that go equally spaced all the way around the piston so that it can equally fill up the chamber without having a problem with coming in and then having to go sideways and then come out. It basically has an equal space. Now on the other side, they're not equal space, which is not the part that matters. The fluid comes in, hits the sharp angles, which have been found over the years to be a good form of high speed resistance without harshness. And then the inside part is what does all the centralizing of the fluid. Now when the outer cone fits in there, obviously now we have this valve that can displace a lot of fluid. When you have a shim stack and you have your shims in there, you have your bleed shim. Some people opt not to use bleed shims and use holes. And then you have your shim stack. So when your shim stack is up against the piston and it opens, you get a very narrow section of fluid transfer. Plus you're trying to bend the shims away to get the oil to go through. Whereas a cone, you can put a little bit of pressure on it, but it's still going to pop open when you hit little bumps. But you're going to get a lot more low speed out of it, especially the more pressure you put on it. You're going to increase the pressure, but if that pressure is overcome by, say, a sharp rock or a sharp bump, it doesn't have to open very far to let that pressure out. Whereas a standard shim stack, you're not really going to get pressure, because if you do, the section of escape is so narrow, it's just going to make it be super harsh. You're going to get a lot of insane non-movement to the shock, and you can create the type of valving where you get the oil to stretch. Your fluid isn't going through the piston as well as it should, so it's going to create a cavitation. You can get away with any kind of manipulation, but having a double way to remove fluid so that the fluid can come by the internal splines, can go past the spacer that we have here, and then we have a shim stack that covers that, and it creates a certain amount of preload on this cone, but it lets the oil come out the side. It's not creating any 90-degree angle detour along the way. And then with the outer cone over there, the oil is coming out of these side holes in the cone, and it's releasing both fluid from the inner and the outer cone. Now we have our travel limiting spacer, which is, I like it because it looks really great, but we also have the ability to control how far the cone opens. But unlike the stock system where you have a top out washer, where the top out spring hits against that washer when your shock is extended, we have, instead of a washer, we have kind of a solid array of a cylinder. We're using that cylinder in multiple fashions. We're using it to control our pump system. We're using it to control the amount of fluid that can get out. We're creating it to look awesome, of course. We want to have the nicest looking parts on the market. But this piece does multiple things. It guides our internal spring. It gives us the top out protection. And it also allows us to control how far our cone is opening. So we can change that, and if we want to do, like, say, supercross on a side-by-side, we can limit the control of this, still use softer mid-valve springs, and literally not have any bottoming whatsoever. Or we can open it up to our standard range, which gives us the ability to have plushness when you're hitting sharp rocks, and still have our awesome low speed character and whatnot, and we'll get to that, how that works. So this piece is we call our travel spacer. We have our mid-valve spring, which we can tune to different rates. We have different springs being made. Now this spring doesn't have to travel very far, but it's going to progress. And in order to progress, you have to have a pump system. In order to have a pump system, you have to feed fluid down into the pump area. So the way this system works is this tube slides over the shaft. It has holes in the side of it, and fluid can get down through the top of it. And then we have our pump cup, which is sealed off by an O-ring on the shaft and on the inside of the pump cup, which allows us to get pressure in there. So we have an inner pump piston, which the inner pump piston is sealed off by an O-ring. And then we have our outer pump piston, which is no O-ring on the outside, because all of the holes that are in the side of the chamber, we don't want to have any O-ring tears or anything. So we have the fit, so that the right kind of plastic and the right kind of aluminum, so everything expands together. And so when this is down at the bottom, it's covering all these holes, and as it comes up, it starts dissipating the fluid around, allowing the spring to stop its movement. So when it gets